Hello and welcome to Ordinary, a podcast that aims to help Christians live for Christ in everyday life. My name is Josh Bannister, and each week I sit down with a couple of UK pastors, Graham Nichols and Mark Whettam. Today we're talking about the local church. How involved should you be with your local church in terms of participation and service? Can I be devoted to God but not to a church or its people? Where should church life come in the list of priorities? All this and more in today's episode, so sit back and enjoy.
I am Graham Nichols.
And I am Mark Whettam.
And I am Josh Bannister, and you're listening to Ordinary. Welcome back to this week's episode of Ordinary. I am back from my holidays, had a week off, and haven't yet caught up on last week's Ordinary, but I hear that it was a great episode, so I'll be tuning into that this week to have a little catch up. But
I think it was good. It was all about prayer. It was lots of practical tips, but a bit of philosophy and theology about it as well. So lots of stuff worth listening to in it.
That's excellent. You had Isaac, did you?
We had Isaac, yeah. And as always, he did a very good fill-in job.
Did he?
He's not Joshua though.
No, he's not. No. Did he do?
No, he's Isaac.
Did he do a video and everything?
He did a
We
video.
did video. We did everything.
Oh,
What do you think we are, amateurs?
Well done, guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. No.
He's still working on the sizes though, but I think today we're going to be like perfectly sized.
Yeah,
One
I
week
hope so.
I was big and you two were small, and then last week Mark was big, and then Isaac was slightly smaller, and then I was slightly smaller. So hopefully you're seeing us all now perfectly sized.
On my screen, we all look about the right size, so I'm hopeful for our future. But
I'm hopeful too.
I think that this morning it's all been terrible so far. We've had about 3 attempts at this podcast so far, and the tech has failed, but I think we're onto a winner now. Everything seems smooth and hunky-dory, which is good because it's complicated, right? We're recording about 8 things at once, trying to get this new season all nice and slick. But I think we're good to go. It's feeling good.
I think we are too, and so we're looking forward. What we're going to talk about?
Well, we are going to talk about church today. Local church involvement. Basically, we want to have a discussion about how we determine as individuals who are part of a local church how much we are to be involved in church life and what it looks like. I suppose what level of involvement is appropriate, and also in part of that's going to be about balancing the demands of people's work lives and home lives with their church involvement. So that's where we're going. I think maybe we'll start by talking about the principles of being involved in church. That seems a sensible place to start. Is it just something that we do because we consider it a good deed, or is there biblical mandate for people to be part of a local church and not just part of it technically, but actually involved in the day-to-day runnings of the church or the weekly runnings of the church?
Yeah, I think Mark can get us into the theology in just a sec.
Yep.
But just another little bit on the why, because it might just kind of pull people into why are we talking about it. I think on the one hand you might have this setup where you think, so church leaders always want me to do more church, and I always want to do the smallest amount of church that ticks the box. That's a complete caricature, but that's the danger where you fall into these camps where church leaders want to do lots of church, everyone else wants to do the minimum church. Of course, neither are right, and both are a caricature. But I think that's why it's worth talking about, because you might say, what's the point? It just all happens, kind of thing. But I think it is worth talking about by way of principle and then practicality.
Mm-hmm. And part of that is because of the culture we live in. So we're very much an individualistic culture, much more so than probably at other points in history, particularly in the West. I think this would be a different kind of podcast if we were writing in other parts of the world where community, family is much bigger and much more important than it is probably at the moment in the West. And so therefore this is where the tension comes, because you are really going against the culture, as it were. Yeah. But theologically, it's important, because it's not that actually we're never just individual believers. We're saved into being the people of God. And the way in which the Bible speaks of us is more often corporate than it is individual. And actually there is a sense of how do we do things together, how do we witness together, how do we worship together, how do we just encourage one another. And so the realities are that togetherness, our corporateness, is far more important than we probably give it weight to. I think biblically, particularly.
Yeah. And of course, it depends what that looks like, isn't it? Because you can agree, yeah, the corporate's really important. But then this kind of next stage of, okay, so what does that really mean in practice? Where do those things contrast? So, yeah.
Well,
give us a bit of Bible, Mark.
Well, and it's worth, isn't it, just reflecting on some of the passages and how that works itself out. So, if you just, you can do a whole biblical theology through the whole, from Genesis right through to Revelation, where you can see how the people corporately are important. From Adam and Eve in the garden, operating as the people of God, with the mandate to subdue, rule the world. In other words, the presence of God is going out from the garden into the world with all those under his authority as those made in his image. And then you kind of track along a bit and you see how that all gets messed up. But God's so concerned that Genesis 12, he gives promises to Abraham, and his big promise is being a people under his kingship in his land. You then get that worked out in a very specific people group, Israel, and how they work as the people of God. And all the way through, God is always emphasizing that sense of his people, his presence, under his rule. You get to the New Testament, and Jesus really begins to speak about this in terms of how he is gathering people to himself, how he speaks and connects that our love for God is often expressed in our love of others. So, two great commands, love God, love your neighbour. So how those two things relate is really important, that actually you cannot be, Jesus makes clear to the Pharisees, Matthew 23, I think it is, that you can't be saying you love God and doing all these kind of, tithing your mints and your spices, but you neglect mercy, you neglect to love people. So if you are failing to love God's people, then you are failing to love God. You cannot say love God and not love his people. Those two things are interconnected. And then all the way through then the epistles, you get lots of this one anothering language, carry one another's burdens, love one another, minister to one another. You get the importance of 1 Corinthians 12, the body image, that we're all parts, each is equally valuable, you need one another. Ephesians 4 language, that you are being built up together into the maturity of Christ. The whole of Ephesians 1 and 2 is about the fact that we were no longer people, now we're united as one people. This unity that Christ has won for us, that is then brought together in the Spirit, and then together we grow up into Christ and live out what it is to be God's people. And then, of course, you track all the way through to Revelation, and what you see God's people gathered around the throne in Revelation 7, around the throne of Christ. Revelation 21:22, that the city, but it's God's people with their God together. So this corporate dimension just is so important and so underscores what happens. Therefore, it's got to be expressed in local church, because that is the local expression of God's kingdom being worked out in local areas. And of course, the whole time, not only are we just local churches, but we're part of the wider universal church that is alive today, but of all time as well. So that's why it's important, because theologically you just can't avoid being the people of God. And so therefore you've got to then work out, well, what does that mean? What will that look like to be a believer connected to the people of God? Why does Peter make a big thing about being a royal priesthood of believers? It's not just that I'm a priest in the sense of, hey, I can now relate to God individually. There's a priesthood of believers, corporate. What will that look like? What will that mean? How does that work out, express itself in a local church setting in my everyday life?
Yeah, it feels like a lot of that stuff is a really strong biblical argument, theological argument for being a part of a local church, like a member of the church, and subsequently a part of the body of Christ more globally. How do you then, though, begin to determine your level of involvement in that church in terms of service then, I suppose? Because I guess that's where we want to get to, right? It's like, how involved am I? Because you could definitely argue, and I think you have done, that being involved, being a Christian is sort of... it's not an option to not be a part of a church but be a Christian, to reject God's people but accept God. Those two things don't really work together. But then once you're in the church, like, I guess everybody has busy lives, busy home lives, busy work lives. Is it helpful? Is it possible even to start putting expectations or numbers of hours on people's minds when they think about service to church. So yeah, just start working that out for me. Like, where do you begin when you think about your level of involvement with the church?
And it is really hard because the church grounds itself, like hits the ground as an actual organisation with stuff going on, that are meetings that are happening and clubs that are run and, you know, study groups that are happening, all that sort of thing, which are things to show up to. I think though, if you don't get the vision like Mark was just talking about, then you won't even be asking the question, you know, how do I get involved?
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you're captured by the vision, the question will be much more sort of, not so much how much do I have to do, what does that mean in terms of hours? It will be more natural and sort of organic. I know that sounds a bit kind of weird, but just to throw in a different model or a different way of thinking about it as well, which is also biblical, is the idea of family.
Yeah.
So the idea of the people of God that Mark's been talking about, which is great, and runs all the way through. But the idea of family runs there. Yeah. It's there, particularly in the New Testament, I guess, in terms of the model for local churches, where you haven't got a massive assembly of the whole nation like in the Old Testament, but you've got local gatherings which are sort of symbolic of God gathering around his people. Sorry, the people of God gathering around God. And in a family, I was pondering on this as I was walking towards this podcast recording, that in a family, you do have rules and expectations, don't you? But, you know, like how you're going to behave at the dinner table, or when you're going to have dinner, or how many meals you're going to eat a day. And particularly as a child in that family, you conform with those rules, sort of. But you don't really think, what do I need to do to be part of this family? It sort of just happens. And I think the root of any problems we have are because we probably haven't got the vision of the people of God big time, like Mark was just talking about, big canvas view of the people of God. And we also haven't got the view of church as family. So although we'll talk about some other stuff in a minute about kind of what it might look like, it'll all feel very legalistic and tick boxy unless you think, this is my family. And with my family, yeah, of course there's little negotiations about what I can do, you know, and when the family becomes extended, you figure out who you're going to spend Christmas with, and you know, can I go and visit my parents or my children this weekend and stuff. So, and there's always limits, like, you know, I have a job and I have children, and, you know, I have other responsibilities which mean I can't spend as much time with them as I want to or as they want me to. But you don't kind of think, okay, what does that look like? Well, one visit a year would be okay. You just don't start with that. You just kind of start with, you know, I generally want to see them and it all comes naturally. Or does that sound too general, or do you get that? Does that make sense?
No, I think that's really I think that's really helpful as well, because I think part of, you know, when you think of Acts 2, we were looking at it the past weekend in our church weekend away, but, you know, it talks about being devoted to the fellowship, being devoted to that church family. And just the idea of actually centering our whole lives around the local church, or the decisions we make around the priorities, becomes obvious if I'm centering it around family, because that's what I do in family life. Family life is centered, you know, you center your life really around family and how to operate as a family and work things through. That's the kind of how you operate. Now, if we are thinking church as family, then I'm going to naturally want to do that. I'm going to operate, and my life is going to revolve around how am I devoted? How am I loving my church family as an expression of my love of Christ? You know, so it's that kind of thinking. Whereas I think probably lots of our thinking is not that way. It's not centered around that. It's much more centered around my life over here. How do I fit church in? Rather than actually, hold on, I'm a believer who's committed to this body, and that's how I'm centering my life. It then changes how I think about and how that devotedness is worked out.
So are you suggesting that devotedness to God is synonymous with devotedness to church?
I'm saying that the way in which I express my love of God will be seen ultimately in how I love his people. Mm-hmm. So I think there is a connection to that cannot be separated out. So, you know, I'm not going to be devoted to the people in the sense of, you know, you're kind of be worshipping them and they become the heart thing. But I think the way in which the Bible seems to connect it is that those two things you can't be devoted to God. That is not then expressed in a way that is that your life is kind of loving and centered on and being devoted to his people in that way. I think that's the issue, and I think where
it's
we've
the way,
gone
it's
wrong.
the way that
No, well, just the way where we've gone wrong is that we kind of think of, and because of the culture, we've kind of got this devotedness to God. So I can have this sense of my own pietistic lifestyle, worship in my own little way, but I don't see how that's then connected to being part of a church family, being a priesthood of believers, being, his people, this royal chosen nation, as it were.
Yeah, whether synonymous is the perfect word, but it is almost the right word. In that, it's interesting where that text in Acts 2, Mark mentioned, it was devoted to, and it lists a series of things like the word of God and breaking of bread and prayer, and devoted to the fellowship seems to be just part of that. So whether you call it synonymous, but you certainly call it bound up in it, and it's a bit like saying you can't be a study person who thinks I like the word of God, but I don't like remembering Jesus' death, and I don't like praying, and I don't like fellowshipping. Now, what that devotion looks like is not. It sort of is devoted to the church as an organisation, but it's not really synonymous with devoted to the organisation. It's about being devoted to the people.
Yeah.
And then the expression of that is how you work it out in devotion to the gatherings, if you like, or the outreach that the church does, or the sharing of your time and resources. That's where it sort of cashes out. But it starts with you're devoted to that sort of as a concept, or as a heart thing, and then it works its way out in what you actually do.
And I think just to move us into the nitty gritty, how that works is in the sense of it's a mindset, isn't it? So I think often, and I see it in my own heart, Sunday morning. There's a sense of, oh man, it's Sunday, do I really want to go to church? And then it can move into, oh, actually, no, I'm really looking forward to being able to sing, hear a sermon, get, what can I, and I think if I'm devoted to the family and the people, then my mindset shifts to, actually, I'm really looking forward to seeing God's people. How can I encourage? How can I build up? How will me singing encourage others? In other words, the shift doesn't come about my experience and what the Lord is doing in me and teaching me, but actually how he will use me to encourage and build one another up. How actually my very presence can just be an encouragement to others. Not because, hey, look, there's Mark Whettam, but hey, because here is someone who is saying, actually being here is important, because actually not because I need it, but because actually I see it's important to others, and encouraging them and expressing them. And I think that shifts.
Every week I see and hear people saying, hey, look, that's Mark Whettam. And there they are. And I say, yes, he's over there. Can you believe it? Yeah, I think there is the attitude shift, but of course it does cash out in something, because, you can sit at home saying, I really love God's people. I really love them. I really love them so much. And I'm really devoted to serving, and sharing and stuff. But it in the end, it must cash out in something. And yeah, that's kind of worth thinking about, because but it has to come sort of in a spontaneous way. And the something is not, I know I keep saying it, but it's not about the organisation, and it's not about any specific meeting or any specific ministry. If you don't put chairs away, then you're not a good Christian or something. Or if there's something that you're not particularly got a heart for, but if you've got a heart for nothing that's actually going on, you can't really say you've got a heart for God's people. And if you don't want to gather, then you can't say you've got a heart for God's people. Sure. And so it does mean some disciplines in the end. It's a bit like, again, dinner table in a family. You want to eat because you think eating is important, and most families want to eat together. And there is both sort of delight and drudgery in that. Sometimes it's really inconvenient when you get called to eat. You don't want to eat at that time, but you don't want to be a person eating on their own in a family. Generally speaking, I know as you go through teenage stages, it becomes more desirable to be on your own. But that's in a way that illustrates the point. That feels a bit clunky when that's happening. If your teenager comes down, or your younger child or older child, adult comes down, takes their food, goes away, you think, oh, that's a bit strange. That's not normal. And in a similar way, that happens in church life.
But I think,
I'm sorry, I've overdone the.
No, it's good.
Well, no, because I think that highlights something else that often you mention organisation, and there is a sense we are.
Yeah.
But actually, we're more of an organism, aren't we? In the sense of we're alive. The people of God aren't just a structure, a kind of a company, a corporate, a store. We are alive and breathing and together. And in that way, if you're a body that is alive, then to go to you need to eat, you need to feed, you need to be encouraged, you need to be built up. So how do you do that? It's that sense of moving from just being an individual to this corporate sense of togetherness as a living organism that is breathing and living and needs one another. And when how am I devoted to that? And I'm not devoted to a structure. I'm not devoted to just kind of programs for the sake of programs. I'm not being devoted to a corporate enterprise that is just seeking to be a club that is kind of we're a living organism with our head who is Christ. And how do we operate therefore in that way? How am I kind of so alive and breathing and being connected to it because both I need it, but my part is needed as well. Without me, something is missing because I'm committed to this church family. I think it's kind of shifting our thinking in that way.
Should we talk about some practicalities? Should we talk about Sundays?
Sure.
I think that you could have an endless debate about quite how Sunday maps to the Old Testament Sabbath and all that stuff. But at a very practical level, the church in the New Testament met on the first day of the week, and culturally we're kind of allowed to do that. So I think Sundays are really important as an expression of participating in the body, being part of the church, being part of the family. And we have a couple of meetings in our church. Some of you listening might go to different churches where you have one, might be in the morning, might be in the afternoon, or you have two, might be morning and evening like we do. But I think whatever your church has decided is the right thing to do, it's worth thinking, can I try and participate in that? Because it's not like a sort of theatre showing or a cinema showing where you say, shall I go to the matinee performance or shall I go to the evening? And sort of it's more like, shall I go to the morning meal and the evening meal, or shall I just go to the morning meal? It's more like that. And so I think healthy participating in church life, you go to at least one gathering on a Sunday as a sort of priority, and you sort of work your life around that. But probably two. I don't know what you think about that, Josh. We've really enjoyed seeing you on evening meetings because you got a baby and you bring the baby along, and so it's like really good habits for the baby already. It's already built in. It'd be like, oh, can we go out to evening church now, Dad, when he's 2 years old?
yeah. I'm sure you like it until he starts screaming, and then I have to go and run out into the back corridor and stand up and hold him for an hour, which is fun for everyone. But no, I don't know. I'd be really like, I don't know. I'd be really careful to be like, oh, you should be at both meetings, everybody, just because I'd feel like, oh, I don't know what people have got going on in their lives. But I definitely agree with you that, I mean, what is it to be involved in a church and to be a member of a church if you're not meeting with that church at least once on a Sunday? That seems like one of the most fundamental parts of being involved in a local body. So yeah, I agree with you basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard with the twice. Sorry, because I really don't want people to feel like, well, if I don't come twice, I'm a bad Christian. Yeah, but it's always just raising the question about it, just the why. And of course, I've got loads of relatives with children who clearly can't easily both come out of an evening, and sometimes just because of the demands of the children or the family life during that day, they just can't hack it in the evening. Sure. And I totally get that. I just know my own heart, and I know that there's just always the temptation that you just get a bit too comfortable, and people do what they want to do, and so often, so it's always raising that question, but without saying you're a bad person if you don't come. Yeah, sure. And go on, Mark. Sorry.
Well, it's the word. We're not saying you should, but it is a question of why would you not want to be? Like there is a sense of why, if you can, would you not want? And it's not always possible. We get that. Yeah. But I think sometimes it's more habit than it is a kind of, a good theological reason. I think it's more a sense of just, this isn't what we do, or actually, we kind of got into, well, we just do church on a Sunday morning. But I think this whole idea of actually, there is a sense, particularly, where actually the whole day is a chance just to be different, to say, actually, here's a difference that's the whole idea of the Sabbath, isn't it? Now, we're not holding to a Sabbath theology as such, but the day of rest, the day of saying, actually, here's just a chance where I've been freed up from having to do the normal labours of life to come and hear God's word, sing with God's people, be encouraged, meet up, enjoy fellowship.
Yeah, I think that's why the wraparound is really important, isn't it? The fellowship before and after a meeting, the chats with people, and the possibility, at least, of hospitality, even if it's like very light hospitality, like you just have lunch and then you go your separate ways. It doesn't have to be like, I'm going to provide entertainment for the whole day for somebody. But
can I
wraparounds
to play devil's advocate? Like, I guess it's probably quite a modern thing, is it, that churches are beginning to have, some churches are beginning to have one service rather than two? I assume, like, traditionally speaking, probably it's much more of a morning and an evening vibe. So, but I suppose in recent years, there's been a little bit of a shift towards just having a one service. Is that, and I suppose you could ask the question, it's like, is two services arbitrary? Like, why not have three? Because to push your logic further, you'd be like, well, if you can meet, why wouldn't you? And it's like, okay, well, let's have 3 meetings then. Let's have 4. So why is 2 a good number, do you think? And why is it actually that some churches have switched to the 1?
Yeah. I think it is slightly arbitrary in that some of the people who've gone to one service, it partly grew out of some of the kind of new wave charismatic churches where it was a very long meeting with lots going on, which was kind of absorbed a lot of the time. And so in one sense it's arbitrary, but it is what your local church. So when I was talking about it, I was saying if your church has decided on one meeting, then it's one meeting. But if the church at this point have decided on 2, that is what the family have sort of decided. And the family can always debate that and say, perhaps we ought to go to 1. But having said it's arbitrary, I think it's a really good way of bracketing the day. And I think 2 has some benefit over 1 in that particularly in our culture, the second one can be a bit more relaxed and a bit more centered on discipling, whereas perhaps the Sunday morning can be more focused on a sort of wider group. So I think there's lots of sort of practical benefits, but I think bracketing the day is really important. And I know it's not the same as the Old Testament temple service, but the idea of morning and evening sacrifice, I think, is quite good. To think I'm sort of remembering Jesus at the beginning of the day and remembering Jesus at the end of the day. So I would say it's theologically, I could never argue that it has to be, but I think it's more than arbitrary. I think it has some benefit. What do you reckon, Mark?
No, I agree. I think the patterns are there rather than it's not a rule, is it? And there's no law and there's no biblical command that you must meet Sunday morning, Sunday evening. But the patterns of morning, evening are there. And I think it is the bracket, but it also just gives a shape to the day, doesn't it? That actually there's a good thing, isn't it? Gathering together as God's people. You then can go away, and often Sundays are a great day to do hospitality with others of the church family. So it's not saying every Sunday, but it's a really good way of just saying, hey, let's gather as a smaller group, and then, hey, we come back together and enjoy fellowship together again. And it kind of just gives a shape to saying, actually, here's a day where I am, in the busyness of life, prioritizing God's people, meeting with them, and how I do that, whether it's gathered corporately, then maybe in kind of much more around the table, and I think they are the patterns you see, when in Acts 2, devoted to the teaching, devoted to fellowship, devoted to breaking the bread, communion, but it's also kind of inferring eating together. You get that ideas throughout the New Testament. So I just think here's a great day to do that. Now, that's not to say every Sunday, we're having people around, but why, I think we've kind of also got out this habit of just, actually, this is a really good thing just to be able to eat together and enjoy time together and make that a sense of this is how we delight in one another as God's people.
So having done Sundays, is that it then, do you reckon?
That's a good question.
We've done a good job on Sundays, and let's say we're coming to 2 services and we're having people round, and then that leaves us the rest of the week to get on with our own lives, isn't it? Because
Well, conscious that time is running out, but let's think about small groups and just kind of the importance of those, because again, they're chances, aren't they, to the corporate big, particularly the church our size now, it's very hard to kind of have lots of meaningful relationships, but a small group is a chance to kind of do that kind of meaningful, much more intimate, pray for one another, share life, do the kind of one anotherings in a really meaningful way that is maybe not possible. Now, community groups for us, we have some groups that run in the evenings, we have groups that run during the day because we realise people can't all do evenings. But again, I think just being committed to one of those for your own sake and to care for others, again, you know, it's not a should. The Bible doesn't say you must, but it's a good thing for your own health and for the health of others. It's another way of meaningfully connecting. And then, you know, I'll just start throwing out some other things. But I think in that sense, you'd want to be part of how the church, you know, to then use the gifts how the Lord uses you. Are there other opportunities to serve in the life of church because you're helping either to disciple maybe younger folks or disciple older folks, or to reach out to a particular group, those from different nations, so an internationals group or an older group or a particular. In other words, you then are starting to think, well, how can I use the gifts God has given me to either disciple, to be part of the church's corporate discipleship or the church's corporate evangelism outreach? How might I use that? So they would be a good things to think about. How am I using the gifts the Lord has given me to further his kingdom inwardly, outwardly?
Graham, final thoughts?
I agree with all those. I think as well, what I love to see is organic stuff happening as well, which is not instead of feeling some degree of, you know, I'd love to serve. It's a bit like the equivalent of the selling your stuff in the New Testament, because really, you know, selling my car and giving you the money is not going to help you much. But serving to the sort of activities of the church is the sacrifices I think we can make. Mm-hmm. But I think people doing life, you know, you can't do life with 170 other church members, but you can do life with a subset of that. And it might be your community group, but it might be as well a particular friendship network you've got within the church, but you're doing it kind of consciously as the church, rather than just saying, well, you know, doing basketball is great. I know some of you guys do basketball, and it is a great way of both keeping fit, enjoying sport, and also sort of developing friendships. So that's kind of doing life, but it's off the back of that, thinking I'm kind of involved in people's lives in a spiritual way. And I think that's the bit we're sometimes missing is we can either do life or we can't do life. But either way, we're not always doing it very spiritually. And you know, it's not like saying, well, you know, how are you serving God in your work today? But it's speaking spiritual thoughts into lots of things as we kind of do life together. And my observation, particularly over the last 10 years or so, is that doing life, or put it another way, we can be quite committed to serving in the church and come into those meetings and gatherings, but we're not kind of understanding where each other are at spiritually and speaking into each other's lives and helping to admonish one another and grow one another. And we're not often praying for one another, which comes off the back of that and feeds into that as well. So even using practical tools like the prayer diary, but even just praying for other people as you kind of, and then asking and then following up. But yeah, I think that's part of church life, and part all of us need to work on a bit, I think.
As a really helpful thing, isn't it? Just that balance between overdoing stuff, so we're just part of a program, but also kind of the organic sense of just caring, loving, honouring, you know, talking to one another, doing life together, as we seek to, you know, make disciples of all nations. I think that's a really good little clarifier at the end there.
But a bit like we were saying with joy last week. Sorry, I've now said what I'm going to say. A bit like we were saying with prayer last week. It's joy in this. It's not drudgery. And you know, sometimes coming to a family meal is a bit of a pain because of what you want to do at that moment. But overall, you know, we love being in families. Most of us, most of the time, in God's goodness, and we love being in the church. So although we're kind of thinking of practicalities, in the end it's joy, because when you're in amongst God's people, you feel the presence of God, you see God's Spirit at work in their lives, and it gives you great joy. And so enjoy it, guys.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Ordinary. We hope you enjoyed it. To keep up to date with future episodes, hit subscribe now.